Hi, hello, and welcome to Books Insight, the podcast where we hopefully give a little bit of insight into books. I'm one of your hosts, Ren, and I have my co-host.
Don.
And today we're going to be talking about Dostoevsky and specifically notes from Underground and possibly also giving some general reading updates as we move into the third month of 2024. So, Dee, did you have kind of like a summary of your overall sort of feeling about Notes from Underground before we get into the nitty gritty?
I liked a take on this work by the theologian critic Berdayev, who expressed the idea that Dostoevsky was opposed to a form of determinism that was getting rooted about in Russia at the time. There's a particular guy in a particular book that he was taking exception to, and so in the book we read, he argues against. He just says if things are determined, then nobody's responsible for anything. Blah 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 blah. That kind of is part of what he talks about.
Hmm.
But then the secret thing is that he says, I don't agree that that's true. I think we do have choice, but I think because we're weak human beings, we screw up over and over and over again, or we're selfish or egotistical with that freedom. And the only way out of those two directions, one where you're roboticized into believing you do whatever you do and it's nobody's fault, or you're being selfish and screwing up the world, the only way out of that is to reach beyond what's known to God and get on the track of divine providence, which will then guide you to be your best self. And that would be the only cure. I think that makes sense of this book to me, although there's a lot of really fascinating details we can get into.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Actually, it was interesting because the edition of Notes from Underground that I have, which is this one, it
Uh,
actually includes an excerpt from that other novel, What Is to Be Done by
okay.
Chernyevsky.
Yes.
And that was very useful. But I read it after I had actually already completed the notes and also having read the introduction. So I think I think that was probably for the best, just because it allowed me, I think, to digest the information he was giving me a little bit differently than if that would have been in my mind when I was reading
Right.
it.
Right. Right.
But I would say in brief, I really liked it, but I think that he was stronger in the actual little anecdotes that wrote about as opposed to the first chapter, which is that long sort
Uh,
of treatise that he's giving,
yeah.
just because I felt like, and I think you said this too, that felt a little repetitious at
Oh,
points.
yeah. Yeah.
And it was also just sort of like, I think in my notes I wrote, it was giving old man yelling at cloud to me. You know what I mean? Like that a little bit. But then when he sort of was able to make it concrete with those three little stories that he
Right.
told, I think
Right.
it worked better for me personally.
Yeah, I think something I read again also it gave me an insight that I think is accurate. That the first half is sort of a person struggling with their own internal guidance system in life. He's totally alone, even though he seems to be talking to people. He's the only. There's one person, you
Hmm.
know, almost like insanely playing both parts, but he's alone in the underground, you might say. And in the second part, it's like you shift to the how do you behave in the world, and it's a whole bunch of reality pieces which exemplify the same issues, I guess you could say. Well, like here's another piece. This is David McGarshak, one of the
Mm.
translators I didn't read. I don't really like him a whole lot, but he wrote a biography, or he put a biography together, which largely was notes and letters of Dostoevsky, not so much
Okay.
McGarshak talking. So he says, but McGarshak says in that biography, part one is a closely reasoned attack on scientific determinism of the utilitarian thinkers, and more particularly of the vision of Chernyshevsky in that book. And Dostoevsky said in an article that he wrote, uh, or no, I mean, Chernyshevsky said, defending the doctrine of enlightened self interest, a correctly conceived egotistic desire for happiness was bound to lead to a state of universal happiness, which is almost like the Republican Party in America saying everybody will lift themselves up by their bootstraps and we'll all be at least middle class and above. And I'm going, no, how can that be? That's like Baron Munchausen lifting himself by his pigtail, you know. And you go, it doesn't work that way. If there's millionaires at the top, there's going to be paupers at the bottom, unless you create a more socialized system. But Dostoevsky's, I think, saying if you try to do that mechanically, you'll get robotic. You'll get 1984 or something.
Mm.
And if you leave everybody to their own devices, you'll probably have chaos because people are not instinctively caring, according to him.
Yeah.
And again, Dostoevsky's, without ever bringing it into the story, he's almost saying what's left, divine guidance, is the only way out of this.
Yeah, which I'm just gonna predict you and I would probably somewhat take issue with as a conclusion. And I think for me, the best way that I can approach what exactly my criticism is, other than just, but what if no God? Like, but
That's a pretty big one.
but right, but like I think that the other question that I have from this, and I also understand contextually that he was writing this after having experienced being through the prison system, which I can only imagine was, despite the fact that in some ways it sounds like it wasn't horrific in the way that I would have imagined it was as an experience of that type of situation. I'm sure on some level that was pretty traumatic. And I think, and having read it, like some of the things he wrote before that happened and after, I can even see a shift, I think, in him to being a bit more sad
Yeah,
and angry and skeptical and cynical and feeling like, yeah, the worst of people, thinking the worst of people. But my thought when I was reading that in these stories was, yeah, but there are lots of times that people do things that are not in their own best interest that we would consider good things. And I don't think he was really taking that into consideration. Like, for instance, it's irrational for firefighters to exist. Like, the idea that as a person you would run into a burning building doesn't make sense. It's not a rational thing to do, really, from the
yeah,
perspective of life.
right.
But people do that, and we are glad that people do that. Now, he might say, yeah, but that's a utilitarian argument. Like, it might not be the best thing for that guy, but it is the best for the situation because the most people would survive, blah, blah, blah. But I would still say, yeah, but like, not all people can do that, will do that, would do that. And it is an example of a person doing something against their own best interest, but that it
Right.
wouldn't be chaotic or negative. It's something we view as positive and good.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. No,
So,
yeah, Schopenhauer has a story I've probably told you before
mm,
about, uh, let's say he gives this example. He says, let's say a baby or somebody's rolling off a cliff and a man dives to save the
mm,
baby in such a way that he's actually not protecting himself. And except for the fact that another guy grabs his foot, he would have gone overboard with the baby.
mm,
Schopenhauer says, why would anybody do that? And he said, his argument is the veil was lifted momentarily,
mm,
allowing the insight that all is one. And this guy saw the baby going over as if somebody were pounding a hammer on his foot and his
mhm,
own. And so, of course, he reacted as though it were a violation to himself. And you go, okay, well, I don't know that I buy that, but it is sort of a way of explaining of the fact that people can be incredibly compassionate and behave in ways like the
mhm,
firefighter. Also, as far as the story in particular goes, I've also read recently in researching all
mhm.
this, the likelihood that Dostoevsky was a masochist. And if
I
that's true, then some of the insanity of the first part, especially, and some of the issues in the second part would be magnified in the way that they are in that story because Dostoevsky was deranged in a way to express them so extravagantly that another person would hardly buy that could, you could even, why would you even say that? Nobody's going to buy it. But for Dostoevsky, it might be, of course, you might want somebody to, beat you and whip you. I mean,
Mm,
he gets so animated in his discussion of hate and fear, and it's just like
mhm.
so overboard kind of, that would really make sense to me. But how
Yeah,
did
well, and if I may just interject, I also I not only am not surprised to hear you say that, but I do find that interesting. I'm curious now about that because I haven't actually read any biographies of him. I've only ever read what he himself has written or what was included in introductions to the things I've read that he's written.
right?
But um something that I find interesting is that I nevertheless feel like I kind of understand who he was as a person because I think, and this also speaks to taste somewhat. And I think this is also something that was just different in how people were writing fiction at that time, where it was a little bit more permissible to be as the author very present in your own texts in a
Mm-hmm.
way that I think would not be acceptable in mainstream publishing now. Like, I mean, Tolstoy would do this too, for sure, where he's just like in the middle of War and Peace, he'll just go off on like some tangent for a couple pages because he wanted to make sure you understood. And he's just speaking as himself. And I think Dostoevsky as well does this very often. I jokingly always refer to that character in his stories as not Dostoevsky because it is him, I think, a stand in for himself. And I think in this one, especially, that shines through, particularly in that first part. I almost would go so far as to say that's not part of the fiction. That's an essay that he wrote about how he feels and what he thinks because of how much he hated that those discussions of determinism connected to like industrialization and
Right. Social
machinery,
engineering. Yeah.
yeah, and engineering, all those things. Like that just to me, in my mind, I filed it under this is a thing that he just directly thinks. He wasn't really exploring it. And that to me also was why it was slightly weaker, I think, personally, than when he actually sat down and wrote the fiction aspects to it.
Yeah, I would go with, here's another way to look at this too. There's a famous book called I can't remember what order it is, the Hedgehog and the Fox. I think
Oh
that's,
yeah, you've mentioned this. Yeah,
and
go
I
on.
forget if it's Isaiah Berlin or this other guy can, but the point of the book, it's from a famous, Archilochus was an ancient Greek, and he said,
Mm,
the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing.
mm,
And the book claimed that Tolstoy was a fox and Dostoevsky was a hedgehog. And it's really a cool idea because you can go through history and assign people to different sides of that. Like
mm,
Aristotle is a fox and Plato is a hedgehog. Plato had one big idea, like there's a perfect world that we're like a reflection, a poor reflection of, whereas
mm,
Aristotle was busy going like, gee, here's how animals behave and here's how things grow and
mhm,
here's everything about the actual world. So if you take Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and say Tolstoy had this broad, giant canvas, these huge books that sprawl all over Russia and thousands of, hundreds of people in the characters and
mhm,
that. And even though he gives personality to the people, and even though the biographer of Dostoevsky would say, I think Tolstoy is the superior novelist
mm,
overall, but
mhm,
Dostoevsky plummeted or plumbed the depths of the human being, the human psyche,
mhm,
that Tolstoy didn't go to that level with. And I think I really liked the first part. It got tiresome, but I was very impressed that he would detail so incredibly the shift back and forth of between like, am I an idiot or am I a genius?
mm,
Am I a worm or am I a hero? It's like, and he was like, the fact that we're not cardboard cutouts of one or
mhm.
another thing. We're like a stew of all this crap, and he's like stewing about his lack of identity because he's got all this stuff going on, like almost schizophrenia. Like he's
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually while we're still on that first part before we actually get into the stories themselves.
Mhm.
Something that struck me about the first part, and this is more to do with the paratext and to do with like the broader, I think, social discussion or the place that that part of the text holds within literature and literary discussion it's one of those books where I see it referred to, and now I understand why, even though I don't quite agree that that's fair, but I think it's true, sort of, is it's considered kind of a red flag book. Like if a person were to, like, I'm not saying I think this, but I'm just saying in discussions of this, I've seen it described one of two ways by two different groups, and I understand both. So I've heard it described as kind of a red flag book in the sense that if a person were to say, I loved that, there would might be a question of why. Like,
Yeah.
what about it did you like? And that leads to the second group of people who I think really like this. And the translator of my edition, who is Matlaw, did, I thought, a very interesting thing in the introduction where he pointed out that there's a subset of fans of this story,
Mhm.
specifically, I think the first part probably,
Mhm.
who sort of misunderstand it in a funny way, where I'll actually just quote from him directly because
Yeah,
I
yeah, I'd
think
be
he
curious.
explained it very well. And this was the part that more than even the context in which Dostoevsky was writing it that I found personally very interesting. So he says, readers of the work have all too eagerly accepted the image of the narrator as the symbol of modern man, as a precursor of existentialist thought, as themselves. Like the narrator, they permit themselves to a loophole. It is what the narrator represents, it is his plight, his intellectual temperament that are recognized as their own, but not usually his personality. In fact, however, the two necessarily complement each other. The narrator's figure has so impressed itself in the consciousness of readers that he has been made into an archetype. Criticism rarely speaks of him as a narrator and has made him into the underground man. And I really strongly agree with this because I've in talking about this and my experience reading this book on TikTok, the audience that garners is a very specific type of person usually. And anecdotally, and also I've read about this from others and some of the famous people like Jordan Peterson that like this speak to this a little bit too. But it's usually, how do I want to put this politely? Western white men between the ages of around maybe 20 to 45
Okay.
who are who think of themselves as intellectuals as yet undiscovered by the world, who are nihilistic fans of existentialism, who think that they're that they're smarter than other people because they think the world is terrible. And if you don't think so, you're not clever like they are,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah,
That
kind
type
of.
of
I think as far as in the book goes, I would say I do see for foreshadowing of existentialism in this
yeah.
regard, that the character says, I object to public morality and public rules, and I
Mm-hmm.
think people should act out of themselves. And existentialism seems to say, for you to be authentic, you can't be just following some guidebook. You have to be
Mm-hmm.
inventing yourself, as it were. Uh,
Yes.
on the other hand, Dostoevsky seems to overall lean toward a God idea that the existentialists throw out.
Which
You
is
know,
why this is funny to me because and very interesting. And I have a thought about where these wires got crossed
uh,
because I agree that that's what's actually in the text. And that's the reason why people like Jordan Peterson like this, because he latches on to that God is the answer part. But
okay,
because he is also so beloved by people who are atheists, it's a weird thing. If you're not familiar with him, this is a rabbit hole and
oh
don't worry about it.
yes,
But
uh,
the triangle we're trying to square here is that people like Jordan Peterson would be the type of person who's like a conservative commentator of things and also a
okay,
psychologist who specifically has given several talks about how much he likes this story specifically.
hmm.
And it's because he thinks as well, like I think is what's there, that it implies that you cannot have morality unless you believe in a God, because people
Oh,
are not naturally good. And
that
that
yeah, I think that Dostoevsky is sort of hinting at that,
that's what I think too.
but I don't happen to agree personally
Right.
because I don't believe
So
in God.
right, me neither. And so,
And I
and
do
I
think
don't
people,
like Jordan Peterson for other reasons, but that's why he would like this. And he speaks
right.
about that being why. But what's interesting is that a lot of people who like him and who like this are atheists or at
Okay,
least agnostic. And I think that the way that that gets squared is because even though I think such people think of themselves as deep thinkers and existentialists, I don't think they really are. And what
right,
I actually think the answer is in this text. And I think that's why it's even funnier that such people are fans of this, because in a way, I think Dostoevsky is kind of making fun of this type of person, because
yeah,
the underground man, as he is as a character, is capricious and is sort of all over the place. He can't
right,
even decide if this is being written for himself or for an audience.
right.
And I think that the implication is it's kind of he kind of knows he's writing it for an audience. And there's one quote that I'll pull and then I'll hand it back over to you. But this is my big brain moment from this where I read this quote and I just thought, I think that's kind of what this is all about.
Uh,
So this is right at the beginning of chapter two,
okay,
and right at the beginning of the story of him meeting up with those old school fellows of his. So he
right,
says, dreams were particularly sweet and vivid after a little vice. They came with remorse and with tears, with curses and transports. I believed blindly at such times that by some miracle, through some external circumstance, all this would suddenly open out, expand, that suddenly a vista of suitable activity, beneficial, good, and above all, ready made, would rise up before me, and I should come out into the light of day, almost riding a white horse and crowned with laurel. I could not conceive of a secondary role for myself. Either to be a hero or to grovel in the mud. There was nothing in between. For when I was in the mud, I comforted myself with the thought that at other times I was a hero, and I took refuge in this hero for the mud. And I think that's the reality behind the people who think that they are the underground man, but I
right.
don't think they understand that part of it. I think they read the first part and they think that's me, a tortured existentialist who understands the world and other people don't. And
Right.
I'm miserable because I know the truth and they would be if they did, but they're not smart enough. But the reality is, I think they just have main character syndrome. And I think that he really nails that in
Well,
this character.
yeah, totally right. I think the stupidity is to say, okay, this character says, I think one of the expressions he uses is a direct man or a ready-made man or something.
Yeah,
The direct persons and men of action.
yeah.
So he makes a comment. He makes the character makes the complaint that those people have at their fingertips the answers to things because they're stupidly accepting the world as it's given
Mm-hmm.
to them, where they don't realize how deep it is. And you go, but you're a complete jerk. You know what I mean? And I think
Yeah.
to say, yes, he's got it, that rich guy is really a jerk because look, he just does the automatic thing. He buys the fashions that he's told to buy. What an asshole. I'm
Yeah.
so you go, no, it's just sour grapes. And if not that, it's still self congratulation for your insight. Whereas if you read the book carefully, you'd go, it's true, this guy is lashing himself and others. And I think Dostoevsky, you're failing to recognize that the self loathing and self lashing is as legitimate as the opinion about the jerky former friends.
And
They behave badly
interestingly,
to
yeah.
him, but he
Mhm.
behaves even worse to them. It's like, so it's not like you could go, he's the hero. You'd go, there is no hero in this, really, in the sense of like, this is the guy we should follow or should identify with.
Mhm.
You'd go, no, he's self-identified as almost psychotic,
Mhm.
um, and he behaves very badly in public. He has momentary gushing desire
Mhm.
to be good. Let's say with the girl,
Yep.
a terrible situation where he's telling her all these things of like, you should not be doing this, and let me help you and come and see me. And then he pulls the rug out from under her
Hmm.
because he's playing both sides. And so there's nothing in this book to me that would justify saying, yeah, the underground man, he's cool. I mean,
I
he's a
know, and
complete.
yet they do. And I find that super interesting because I'd be willing to bet, if anybody would be willing to admit, that there's a definite amount of overlap between the type of person that I think and that Matt Law also identified as the ones who think of themselves as the underground man would be the same types of people who I think would also say they really liked Catcher in the Rye and they think of themselves as Holden Caulfield.
Yeah.
Same type of person. And I think that's unfortunate because it's so obvious even within what actually happens in these
Oh,
stories. It's
self-congratulatory.
it's self-congratulatory, but it's sad because it's like if you go around thinking that what makes you special or better than everyone else is the fact that you're miserable because you have this insight into the nihilism that is the reality of life that
Right.
is debatable also, like it's sort of self-fulfilling in a way because it's like, well, yeah, nobody liked like Holden Caulfield, like he was kind of a jerk and
Right.
like and miserable at the very least, and this guy was both a miserable melt and a really jerky horrible person, and that was the reason nobody liked him. So
Right.
what's interesting as well, going to the second story when he goes to meet the classmates, Dostoevsky knew this too. I mean, whether or not he was intending for this to be what the messaging was, I mean, this is what happens is that the underground man, acknowledges that his hatred of these people stems from envy. Like
Right.
he wants to have the success that they have, thinks he deserves the success that they have, even though he's done nothing to earn it. And he frames it as they don't deserve it because they're stupid, and they don't deserve it because they, like the one guy, he's like, oh, he was kind of good looking and funny, and that's the only reason he failed upwards, which is a
Well,
legitimate thing to criticize, but like, what did you do?
well, how
You
about
know?
the wonderful scene where he he hates this guy, that he sees the guy in a bar fight and all that stuff. But the main thing ultimately is he's walking toward the guy, and he deliberately wants to bump into him to
Yeah.
just to show him who's boss. And they bump into each other, and the guy just kind of has a momentary like, oh, and then he just keeps walking and ignores this guy. And the fact that it's whatever, I mean, we we're told what to think about this other
Mm-hmm.
guy, but by an unreliable source.
Mm-hmm.
Probably that other guy didn't do anything in either case. I don't remember the thing at the
Oh,
pool.
it what happens at the bar is that the underground man is just kind of standing there, and this guy takes him by the shoulders and kind of bodily moves
Oh, right,
him
right, 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 right.
somewhere. And
Okay.
that was it. That was all
Well,
that
that was
happened.
yeah. But didn't something happen like somebody got thrown out of a window or
Yeah,
what?
but no, but that wasn't him though. He like I don't remember if that actually he
Well,
saw that happen or he wanted that to happen or something, but he was imagining like, oh
right,
yeah, if I went in there and I was a real rabble rouser, I could get in a fight and get thrown out a window. But then
right,
he doesn't do anything. All that happens is the guy kind of like bodily
right. Well,
moves him out of the
Yeah, he
way.
does go in, and he's
Yeah.
standing there as though in his mind to challenge the guy, and the
Yeah,
guy
yeah,
just
yeah.
moves out of the way. And it's the kind of thing where you could go, we could accept his view that it's the way people behave in real life. They'll just go
Yeah.
like, that person looked at me a certain way, and I've made a judgment about what it means. And this guy's full of that. He's
Hmm.
constantly presuming things, and he doesn't directly question them or try to get to the bottom of it. He acts on his presumption, and he gets weird responses that he then turns into further confirmation of his wacky, I mean, of his presumption, which is wacky, I think.
Yeah.
So that all the things that the other people seem to be doing that he thinks are mean and cruel aren't. For example, he withholds payment from his servant.
Yeah.
Servant comes in and just looks at him like, well,
Hmm.
and then he's going like, I won't respond. And then finally he just explodes and says, whatever, however that worked out, it was like,
Yeah.
the other guy doesn't really do anything that's that weird, given that this guy started it. You
Hmm.
might say he doesn't
Well,
pay that. He doesn't pay his
yeah,
money.
I liked that moment a lot. I thought it was really well constructed in the sense that I believe it, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
And similarly, I think of the three sort of episodes, I personally liked the first one the best, with the body checking on the bridge thing and like the
Okay.
bar. I
Mhm.
liked it the best because I felt like it was the most exemplary of something I've ever experienced. Like, it's the kind of petty vindictiveness that I'll cards on the table say I've definitely experienced. I've definitely felt that kind of petty vindictiveness before, where you'll have, I don't know if you've ever done this, but like I've definitely had times where something really minor like that happens, and then later, like years later, it could be you're in the shower and you're like, oh, what I should have said was this, and that would have really stuck them. And it's
Yeah,
sort of like I think there's something very, at least to me, there was something very relatable about that story, but it was also really revealing of how not only ridiculous, but also poisonous that mindset is to you. Like there's
right.
that expression, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's a good one.
yeah, and that story in particular of the three really embodied that to me in a way that's it, and it wasn't because like it was a big deal to him, but nothing ever really happens. And I
Right,
even felt like he was to me the most sympathetic in that story, because maybe because I saw myself in him in the most in that one, but like also because the guy that he had this beef with, it was rude. Like it was rude to just bodily move somebody like that without acknowledging them. It is rude to bump into somebody on a bridge and not acknowledge it and just walk around them or expect everybody to get out of your way. Like it is. But it's also sort of like, but how much of your energy do you personally want to expend worrying about it? You know,
right,
like you could confront the guy and you
right,
could say, that's very rude. And that
right.
would be a taking some kind of stand on the issue. But what he does is more self satisfactory, where it's like, I feel like I really showed him. But he doesn't,
Right.
because the guy doesn't play ball with him the
Yeah,
way
the
he
guy
would.
doesn't care. Yeah.
No.
It reminds me of things that happen to drivers, like you're driving
Mm-hmm.
along the road and somebody starts tailgating you. And there's a classic thing where people say, oh, yeah, fucker, I'm going to slow down and really burn you. You know what I mean? Like they get into this weird, not road rage exactly, but like a really stupid interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reasonable thing is to get out of the way. And if you feel vindictive, you go, oh, they'll probably get into an accident. They're such jerks. Or you could go, like your mom would say, maybe they're on the way to the hospital and they're
Mm-hmm.
desperate to get somewhere. I better get out of their way, which would be the kind-hearted thing. But I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a classic thing about driving where people get into these mindsets because they're not going to actually have to bump into somebody or have a conflict. They can have the whole thing be imaginary in their head of
Yeah.
that bastard's doing this to because and they make up this entire story that has nothing to do with reality or they don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I have an interesting counterexample that happened to me fairly recently that I've thought a lot about ever since, probably more than I should, but like that I think is almost, I'm happy that I did what I did, because I think if I hadn't, it would have been one of those situations where it would have become a shower thought to
Yeah,
me
yeah,
for
fester.
forever,
Yeah.
which is irrational, which I mean, I guess is what his point is that humans are a bit irrational in this way. But like, anyway, so I was at a cafe that I frequent here in town. And I was sitting at just a table reading a book and eating a piece of banana bread, and I had a coffee or something. And I was completely disengaged with everyone else. And this man was walking by me, and he, again, I wasn't even looking around. So I didn't even realize he was talking to me. He had to repeat this twice. And he said, you know, if you eat a lot of that banana bread, you'll get fat. And I was sort of in disbelief that he was saying this because it was so out of pocket.
Right.
And I I was glad that I was able to spit out in that moment, that was really rude. And he said to me, "Oh, I'm rude." And I said, "Yeah, I think that was really rude." And he was like, "Mm," and then left. And
Okay.
I was glad that I was able to spit that out because I didn't want to have this be one of those things in the back of my mind forever where I think
Yeah,
about it
yeah.
and like, oh, I should have said this.
Was there
But
anybody else in the room? That
well, yeah, I mean, this was at a cafe, but nobody else
okay.
heard this. It was just
Oh,
there
okay.
was
Because
just
I
this
was going to
little
say sometimes,
exchange.
sometimes you get the vindication of the other people looking
Oh,
at you like, yeah, what's wrong with that guy? Yeah.
yeah,
Anyway,
the reason I'm bringing it up is because I think, and again, not to toot my own horn, although I am happy with how I handled that, but it was just
right,
sort of like, what makes me happy about how I handled that? Well, because I don't think that man expected anybody, I don't think he expected me to say anything.
right,
And I think he knew it was rude. Or even if he didn't, I think it's good that he had to think about it.
right. No,
Because
I think,
that's the
yeah,
kind of thing where it's like, when you say things to other people, I do think you should have to think about why you're saying that. And
right,
in this particular situation, it would have been a very different story in the Dostoevsky one. It would have been very different if in the moment that that guy moved him out of the way, he would have said that was very rude. I think
right,
that would have been a very different situation. And I think the fact that he didn't is what makes it difficult because if I hadn't said that to that guy, I know for sure that would have been one of those things that I would have thought about for years afterwards. Like, oh, I should have said. And that to me raises the question of like, if you don't say it in that moment, you are only hurting yourself if you think about it later. Like it is, I think, good and correct and fine to address things like that interpersonally, but I think that there has to be a way for you to get over it
right,
otherwise. Because what is
right.
really the point of me 2 years later thinking in the shower of what I should have said? That man
Right.
isn't going to change. I'm not going to have the chance to say
No,
that
no,
again.
it's
So what does it
exactly,
matter?
it's exactly, and in the story that this guy is festering with
Yeah.
undealt with things. It's true. I think your last part was you don't have to respond, like in a
No.
riposte to a, as if it's a duel. You can ignore the person if you're able to then have it roll off your back.
Yeah.
But if you're the kind of person who's going, what should I have done? Shit, like I feel bad that I didn't do this or that. You're right. Then you're then you're a better method the next time would be to respond at the time because
Yeah, because I think
you're not
it depends
comfortable
on
with it.
what the to me it's like what is the point? Because in the Dostoevsky story, the reason that I think like if he would have told the guy that was very rude, the point of him saying that would have been to have some kind of impact on that other guy's behavior in the future. And
Right,
so it actually would have been somewhat of a selfless thing to say because the
right.
point wasn't for self improvement or vindication. It would have been maybe think of before you do things like that in the future. Think about how that's kind of rude. Think about why you think it's okay to impose your will bodily on another person without talking to them about it
Well, it's
or
also
saying,
you could think of an example too where it might be directly related to saying you're out of line.
yeah,
Using a line example, you go, I'm in line. Somebody doesn't realize I'm in line and they step in front of me.
yeah,
And some people just go like, what? I don't know what to do. Oh, yeah. And then they're thinking, boy, that guy's
yeah,
really. But if you just said, excuse me, sir, I'm in line here,
yeah,
presumably 9 times out of 10, the person would go, oh, I'm terribly sorry, and then go where they belong. And
right.
and some people who do that then go, huh, because they're thinking, huh, I had to do something. Or they just go, okay, no problem.
Yeah.
But occasionally the person that you say, excuse me, I'm in line, they just look at you like, ignore you and stay in there where they are. Then you have to either go, like then people turn around and look at somebody else going, can you believe that guy? They're
Mm-hmm.
looking for support for their view. It's
Mm-hmm.
just one of the great classic things that goes all, it can be turmoil or it can be like who cares.
Well, but I think that goes back in a way, actually, I think it's somewhat revealing of the politics behind the story in this case, because to me, intervening in that moment and saying something out loud to the person is a pro collectivist thing to do
Right.
because it's or at least a pro society thing to do at the very least, which I think is intrinsically somewhat collectivist. But I think that because if the point because by interrupting this person's flow to
Right.
point out that they are not the main character of life, and that there are certain social boundaries that
Right.
actually benefit everybody by not being crossed.
Right.
Like that's kind of what you're participating in. But if you don't say it, and if you don't say anything and you don't care, I think it's a neutral thing. It doesn't
Right.
matter. But if you don't say anything and you stew about it, it's an individualistic thing, because
Right.
you don't actually care about their behavior. It's about you feeling like you could have been the hero, like he
You should have
said.
stood up. Yeah.
Like you, yeah, you're like you're the main character. And
I,
and to me, that is the difference in
well, I'm
terms of
tempted.
how these things impact people and what should be examined within ourselves when we think about things like that after the fact. Is it's you have to remember, like, it's a valid thing for me to feel vindictive, but I don't have to validate the feeling.
No, and I think ironically, or the way I see it from your example, I would say it's both individual and
Mm.
collective. And if in other words, the person's first reaction might be, I mean, it could be a thing like, oh, I better explain to this guy how society works. I'm very calm about it all, but usually the person's like miffed, like, what the hell? I'm going to speak up. And so there is a personal element of like, this incident, offended me personally. I'm the one
Mm-hmm.
who moved, and he's the one who did it. But your point is, speaking up allows for the collective view to be aired, which is
Yes.
in general, whether it's you or me or you or some other people, nobody should be doing that. Is
Right.
the generality, but it's
That's what I
it's
think.
inspired by an actual specific, incident. And maybe sort of like saying, when people go, well, that's just anecdotal, you go, it was an anecdote, meaning it's an actual thing that happened. I may or may not be able to generalize from it to a
Yeah.
rule. But in this case, you could go, here's my anecdotal moment, but I have an opportunity to discuss the rule, which does exist, that
Yeah.
this applies to the situation. So it's both at once. And depending on the emotions of like, that's why if the guy's butting into line, there's the it can be adjusted if the person goes, excuse me, I'm in line here, and the other goes, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
It's a human mistake that both of
Sure.
you can just go, no problem. Whereas if this person gets like, hey buddy, get the fuck out of my way because you stepped in line, you're
Mm.
out of your personal, feeling of I will not be diminished, you know, or the other person might react badly when you do point it out pleasantly. And they might just go, oh yeah, well, too bad, or something
Yeah.
like that. Or like I was working in a bookstore, and his child was screaming and yelling, and I kept wondering what to do. And I finally went up and said, kind of a weird remark. I just said, can we anything be done about this? Meaning, are you just
Yeah.
gonna let this kid keep screaming? He was holding the kid, and the kid was just
Mm.
screaming, and he was looking at books. So he turns to me and he goes, don't tell me how to fucking raise my children. And I'm going, whoa, I thought I asked something I thought quite calmly and reasonably given the situation, but his reaction was as though you're suggesting that I'm not handling this right. And I'm thinking, yeah, that is what I'm suggesting. But
Well,
his
but
attitude was,
yeah.
fuck, So you go,
Yeah.
what?
I think that's actually a perfect example of what I'm talking about, but almost in reverse, because to me, the only reason that a person would, and I'm not saying that like if you're not above this, that you're a bad person or anything, but I just think fundamentally the motivation for those two things does come down to collectivism and individualism, because the only reason that you would take offense or take it personally if a if you were approached by an employee and your kid is screaming, the only reason you would take offense at being told like, could you do something about that, would be if you think you're the main character. You would only
Right,
think that
right,
if you think this,
right,
because
right,
otherwise it's like, obviously in another person's shoes, you wouldn't probably enjoy hearing that in
right,
any kind
exactly.
of public
And
setting.
my character in that story
Yeah.
is speaking on behalf of the collective.
The group, yeah.
Right,
And I think that what's interesting about these Dostoevsky stories is that, and I think it's almost ironic that he was implying that there's something to fear from this I mean determinism I don't necessarily agree with, or I don't always think it's useful the way that it's employed, but the idea that living in a society sort of with rules would always lead to totalitarianism is wild to me, because like and I do think that's somewhat the implication here, especially in the context of him railing against the other book, which does kind of talk about like how industrialization and understanding the human psyche better and like science basically leads to a utopia. The fact that he took offense to that is so interesting to me. Now, I do know that like a lot of people, again, and Jordan Peterson would be one of them. He was just the one I was listening to talk about this recently, so I'm picking on him. But he made this connection of like, and he was right, because look how bad communism was, and that was the
Okay.
precursor. And
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's interesting that you think that, and he thought, Dostoevsky seemed to think that that was the only possible result of collectivism is totalitarianism. That's
Yeah.
wild to me,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I absolutely don't think so. And not only do I not think so, but I also think that it speaks to, I think, something in them where which I would disagree with, which I think that they have a problem with systems, that they think systems are either easily corruptible or are a corrupt thing. Whereas
Right.
to me, I would say systems can be good or bad, but systems are built by people. And
Right.
so even if you have a bad, even if you have a good person, if they're operating a bad system, then
Right.
it's the result is bad. But I don't think that all systems inherently have this slippery slope into totalitarianism. I think that's really wild. I
Oh
think it
yeah. Well,
depends on what your first principles are. Because to me, it's like when I think of first principles, I would say happiness, maximizing happiness in people is like a first principle for me. And how we achieve that aim generally leads into utilitarianism, generally, not rule utilitarianism per se, but like in general. And
right.
like, I think that it's interesting and revealing perhaps of something within these people who would disagree with that, that they think that science leads to systems which lead to totalitarianism. It is very, I think, that's a projection, in my opinion.
I just thought of a thing that's related to what you just said,
Mm.
but more specifically touches on Dostoevsky's belief system, let's say. I don't know if you're familiar with the book. I never actually read the book, but I saw the movie Clockwork Orange.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Have you seen that?
I've seen the movie. I must admit, I haven't read the book.
Okay, well, neither did I, but the movie is what I'm really thinking of
Yeah.
as far as my example goes, because that's all I know. But
Mm.
um, okay, the drift, the issue at large. Okay, the bad guy is like a thug and
Mm.
raping people and doing whatever he wants. He gets grabbed by the police at one point, who actually were his former buddies in the movie, and
Mm.
they're police now, and they take him away. He's going to be programmed so that he won't be a thug anymore. So he's Pavlovianly trained,
Mm-hmm.
like it forces eyeballs open, and he watches movies of terrible events, and he has drugs given to him or whatever, so
Mm-hmm.
that he is appalled at violence. And no, so after they finish with him, they go, okay, here's a club, kill that rabbit or whatever, thinking, we'll test whether you're still the evil person you were. And he picks up the club and he immediately starts throwing up and he can't deal with
Yeah.
it because it's been fixed. My uncle, who was a Jesuit priest, really liked that movie
Mm.
because I don't remember I don't think it happens in the movie, but his issue is what's wrong here is you've taken away this guy's free will. And I think this is sort of what Dostoevsky's talking about,
Yeah.
like saying free will is the most important thing. Sorry, Mike. But um, and it's conceivable that a system could arise that Dostoevsky feared, which would be
Yeah.
like in the movie, which was science fiction,
Sure.
or Orwell's 1984, where they have the guy tortured until his mind is so screwed up that he'll agree that 2 + 2 is 5,
Mm-hmm.
not think that's wrong, meaning you're now the perfect cog
Mm-hmm.
in the system because we don't want you to be able to think for yourself
Mm-hmm.
and the truths that might be outside of our system. So those kinds of fears are so extreme, like Clockwork Orange or 1984,
Sure.
where the alternative is free will, where you accept that mistakes will be made because we're only human, but that we can have a better self that accepts correction when necessary,
Hmm.
and compassion toward others
Hmm.
when useful and when appropriate. So that so it's very interesting. Just, I mean, it's an example that's the kind of thing Dostoevsky was probably imagining or whatever as this direction things would go in,
Sure.
would be the end of free will, and therefore the end of the choice of saying I believe in God and hope to be guided by proper behavior.
And and it doesn't surprise me, again, coming off of his stint in prison, that he would feel this way, because in the House of the Dead, I mean, I would say, to me at least, one of the main points that he makes in that text is that prison, which is a system, and this is where I think it's relevant, but
Right,
is a waste of life. Like, there is no free will really in prison. Like, you're kind of ferried from place to place, you're told what to do, they're
right,
forced to wear fetters, even though it's understood that it's purely symbolic because they can't actually run away anywhere, and
right.
that it's just a waste of life and vitality and creativity and humanity to
And a
put
fearful
people,
system.
yeah, within a system that is, I think he correctly identifies in that time period and place, and in ours, I would argue, corrupt. It is a corrupt system. However, I don't think that, to me, and again, like I say, I understand why that would lead him to think, to be suspicious of systems. I do,
Right,
but I don't think that that's an inherent property of systems like that, of social systems. I
right,
think that they are easily corrupted because they're built by people and
right,
people are fallible. But I think that that doesn't mean that we can't strive for perfect systems. Like, it might be incremental.
right.
Whereas,
It might never be perfect, but if you have the checks and balances, like in our country, we can lean to the left and then lean to the right, because hopefully, as opposed to a dictatorship
mhm,
where the person could go, you know what, people are upset about not having enough food. Well, here's the new rule. I mean, it's like
mhm,
this one guy or a small coterie of people are
mhm.
making decisions as though this will be best for everybody if we just do this.
Yeah.
Meaning, but secretly, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if you have absolute power, I mean, you could go, oh, can you prove that down? I'm going, it seems pretty clear that if people have power, you could say, oh, they have to, they can use it wisely. I'd go, but it's very smart to have checks and balances with
Yes.
that power. That's why we say, for example, if Putin says, okay, I've had my two elections, I'm not allowed another one. You know what? Let's just change that rule and I'll just
Hmm.
continue in power. You go, yeah, it's pretty dangerous to let you make that decision. And in our system, you get two shots at presidency and then you don't
Hmm.
anymore. And I think
Well,
that's
and
pretty
see,
wise.
yeah, and to me, that is why, going back to what I was saying before, what I think my fundamental quibble with Dostoevsky is about this is that, well, two things, I guess. It's two quibbles. Sorry, Fedya, it's two quibbles. But, like, the first one is, I don't agree with that idea that systems are, like, that they can never, that they only, that like they only lead to totalitarianism and fascism, because I think it depends on the system. And that was the point that I think he wasn't toying with that point. He was just talking broadly about this. And I think a lot of people who criticize these things, who are, um, individualists principally, they focus so much on big failed systems. Like, they'll talk about, communist Russia. That was a failure. That was corrupt. It was horrible. It was not good. But I
Right.
think what people latch onto with that is, therefore,
Yeah.
systems like that are inherently bad. And I would say, is it the system, or is it the people running the system, or was it aspects of the system that allowed corrupt people to run that
And
system?
can parts of the system be fixed?
Right. Because to me, I'm like, the reason why I would say that was bad was, at the bottom of it, because people suffered under it,
Right.
period. That's
Right.
how I would identify a failed system. Are people suffering in this system? Then it's a bad system. And he might argue, yeah, well, you're talking about this crystal palace that doesn't exist. Like there is no way to have a system in which people don't suffer, therefore give up on the whole prospect. And I would say we can strive for that at least, because to me, I just don't see how we can maximize happiness without having collectivism at the forefront of how we create a society. I just don't see how.
Yeah,
And I
I'm
just
a
don't.
big proponent, speaking of America,
Yeah.
a little bit outside of Dostoevsky here, but I mean, I've brought this up before, and I really like this way of thinking about things to say, we use the word public, but we might
Mm,
as well use the word socialist
mm,
for public school, public transportation, public library, all these
mhm,
things. And you'd go, our country has been very successful in its struggle to balance between the right wing and the left wing. If you want to say
mm.
right wing is private private ownership and private control of things, and
And free
that
will.
and, right. So example is like you can own a car. You have to earn the money to buy the car, and you can drive
Mm,
around to a spot. Or you can take a public bus, which is a whole lot cheaper than having a car. Now, our country has gone the wrong direction by saying things like a prison, which maybe not even a good system to begin with, but it's way worse when you make it a privatized system,
mhm,
you know, or the roads when you privatize them and say like you have to pay to drive down the street, It's like all these things where you turn a public system into a private one. The tendency is to try to maximize profit and minimize expense, which
mhm.
means you're going to strip away as much as you can the
Yeah.
benefits of this thing. Whereas in the public sector, there is no motive other than to do the thing well. Now, people do say good enough for government work, meaning I'm getting paid. Actually, I work at a library, which I think of as a socialist institution.
Mm,
If we close down, they'll pay me. If I was supposed to work that day, they'll pay me. I go, that's fantastic. I never had a job like that before.
mm,
Somebody could say, well, that's government, blah, blah, blah. I'm going, well, I actually need the money. I mean, I'm a pretty small person in the system. I think it's nice. And I would like more things to work like that.
mm.
Not that, but again, I want the balance. I don't want to say, see how good public transportation is in a library system. Everything should be, publicized, made into a public system. No, I think we try to have a good blend. In my opinion, we've moved way too much to the right with privatizing things that should
Well,
have been public. So
and I think the irony of that dichotomy is that they are both a system, right? And like to my mind, and if anybody wanted to debate this, I think that's fair. I haven't reached some kind of godlike conclusion on this, but like, I, I think that the line of thinking in things like Notes from Underground and that type of belief system, if we cut God out of it, which I was going to get back to him in a second, but like if we take God out of it and we just say you're either going to privilege free will over everything in an individualistic sort of way, or you're going to privilege collective utilitarianism over everything else.
and
To me,
control.
again, yeah, like I'm just like the irony of being, as he was sort of implying to be, anti-establishment is that feeling of wanting complete freedom over your own life and individuality results in a system that causes misery, I think.
Right.
Like, I think demonstrably so for you too, as the person who thinks that, unless you happen to be one of the people at the top of the system. But most people aren't. Like the underground man, he was a bureaucrat, right? Like he worked at an office or something.
Right. Right.
So I'm like, you were never going to be that top person. So the idea that person would want a system or would want a world with no system, which inevitably leads to the systems that you're talking about that restrict actually access to freedom, ironically. I just don't see why, if a person really thought that through, they would come to that conclusion over the idea that the ultimate thing that would maximize happiness, I think, would be collective utilitarianism. But I
Right.
think he's basing this assumption around the idea that you can't be moral if you don't believe in God. And that's where I would bring God back into it and say,
right,
well, I mean, I can't prove that that's not true. Like because I grew up in the United States, we're a country that's founded on Judeo-Christian values that are
right.
steeped in religion. I don't know what I would have thought if I weren't. So like I can't definitively prove that my moral compass doesn't come from that line of thinking, even if I myself would identify as an atheist. Of course, I was influenced by the cultural values that stemmed from these religious principles. However, I think that it's a little bit of a stretch to say that a person can't come to the conclusion that utilitarianism is a good idea unless they're afraid of God or something. I that to me is wild because I'm like, I think even if we didn't have divine morality given to us, I have a hard time believing that nobody would come to the conclusion that utilitarianism is good, even if they were coming at it from a purely selfish standpoint, because utilitarianism
I
is
agree.
good for you
I
and for the
agree.
group.
When I was growing up, at one point, our Mike and I were, I think,
Mm,
talking to our mom or something, and she said something to the effect of, "Well, if I didn't believe in God, what would stop me from, raping and pillaging?" Or maybe it was
yeah.
my dad, but one of the two took that kind of attitude of like, "Why would I be a nice person if there were no God?" And Mike and I looked at each other like, because you're a human being, and you have sympathy and empathy for other people, it's not alien to our nature to feel identify with other people. If you see somebody fall down and you don't have a little bit of an instinct of maybe I can help them up or something like that, or if you see somebody drop something and you go, hey, if they don't notice, I can grab it. I mean,
Yeah.
there are people who do that, and there might even be a momentary thought of like, I could do this or I could do that. But I don't think you have to believe in God to say, I think I'd like to help that person rather than hurt them.
Yeah, I guess what it is for me is that again, I think it gets really convoluted if we start trying to chicken and egg where some of these ideas come from.
Right,
But I, I don't think you have to, even if like for I would be even willing to concede because I can't prove otherwise, and it's probably at least partially true, that at least let's just use the US because that's where we're from, but like that morality at like how we define morality probably is very influenced, I think inarguably probably very influenced by the Bible, right? And it does come from that. Like it is like there are a lot of things that are spelled out in the Bible about how you should live your life that I would agree with, right?
right,
But
right,
I think that it's not necessary, at least anymore, to believe it literally, to be
right,
the word of God, to agree that those are good ways to behave. Like love your neighbor, for example, just as an example, right?
right,
Like to me, that I don't really care if it doesn't matter to me if that came out of a time when people were developing these ideas and also having fear of like divine retribution or something if they didn't follow them. Like
right.
I can still inherit those ideas without having to believe it literally
No,
and still think it's good way to be, like, but as I said, I think taking it one step further, you can still arrive at utilitarianism without that, I think.
yeah, I think two things I'd add. One, there are stories in the Bible which I don't think we have to believe anything about it. We can throw the Bible and burn them all and have
Yeah.
some, but religions tend to have good principles that would work for the group,
Yeah.
except that then a system does get built, like let's say Catholicism or whatever, and then
Hmm.
you have holy wars against a different religion and all kinds of psycho things. Or
Yeah.
today thinking God doesn't want the races to mix. I go, what gave you that idea? Especially if you're quote Christian, read
Yeah.
the New Testament and see what's implied there. But again, I'm not even I don't think it's reasonable to argue like, well, let me show you that the New Testament is consistent with blah blah blah. I'd go, to me, those books are fantasies and mythology. And mythology is full of wonderful lessons,
Sure.
but there's nothing authoritative or especially legitimate about any of them.
Well, that is to me sort of the irony, I guess, at the core of the message of a story like Notes from Underground being if you don't believe in God, you can't be moral. The irony of that to me in a story about the importance of free will
Yeah,
is
yeah,
that I know within Christianity, or I think I know, you correct me if I'm wrong, that is the idea that God grants free will, right? Like that is
right,
kind of the idea.
right. So we have the choice of be good or not, you know.
Right. But the irony to me is that the system, like you said, that is born out of, I guess, the idea that you have free will is a pretty prescriptive system. Like it's not really up to you per se, at least not from what I've seen of organized religion. You don't actually really have a choice. If you are a member of like the Catholic Church, you're kind of going to be told what to think, how to behave, what to
Right, what to
do.
do in a certain circumstance, and a bunch of things that you
Right.
should
So
do or
that's
shouldn't
what's
do.
ironic to me about him kind of implying strongly that you need God to be a good person, and yet the story is also about the importance of free will above everything else, and yet free will gets, I think, squashed within the institution of religion almost every time. And he might argue, yes, but the institution of religion is not God. And I'd be
Right,
like, I guess, but like that's as close as we kind of get
yeah,
here
right,
is like participating within organized religion. I mean, you could be the person who's like, I never go to church because I think the system is rotten. I just follow the principles. And I'd be like, well, good for you. But I think that it's a little bit silly to make it seem like that's most people.
right. No,
You know, I don't.
maybe that's where it does have elements of existentialism in that
Yeah.
most people are not truly existentialists. Most people are probably clutching on to belief systems that are out there that they go, well, without all of that, I'm like naked and alone. And, you
Mm-hmm.
know, what's the point of it all? And maybe I should just go rape and rob. And, you know, nobody's
Yeah.
going to ever judge me except my neighbors. And they're based on some wacky system that they just happen to adhere to. You'd go, well, if you're really getting into that mindset, you might want to write your own version of Notes from Underground and see where that takes you. But
Well, that
I
is the
just don't
hero
think
from
that
the
that
mud thing, isn't it?
yeah, I just don't think that's inherently human nature to be. I think human nature tells us to look out for ourselves, but also to um, clutch on to a society, you might say, or
Well,
um,
we've benefited tremendously from organizing ourselves that way
exactly,
anyway.
exactly. Like you go, okay, we have enemies. The animals are trying to kill us. Why don't we have an agreement where I'll stay up late at night and watch over everything,
Mm,
and tomorrow night you do it, and blah blah
mm,
blah, to protect each other. You go, this is it serves me, and
yeah.
it's you. So there's an organizational cooperation that's clearly beneficial to all of us to
Yeah.
cooperate this way. So yeah,
Yeah.
I just don't think it requires a religion to boss you around about it. I think it's pretty much human nature to recognize that you're part of a group as well as an individual. And if
Yeah.
there's going to be conflicts, you go, wow, there's one piece of candy, who gets it? You know, that's going to happen, but it doesn't mean everything's, you know, got to explode.
No, yeah, and I think that's really what it is. And I want to go back to what you said at the beginning to kind of wrap around to where we started, which was that you were talking about how I don't think you used the word angry. I think you used the word animated or something to describe how he comes across, especially in that first section. So
Okay.
it's almost manic how he comes across to me a little bit in the sense that he just seems so deeply unhappy. And like again, for me, first principles maximize happiness. And it just doesn't seem to me that what he suggests in the notes from Underground would maximize happiness for people, even if initially you might have more individual freedom in a nebulous sort of way. I still strongly feel like that mindset leads to a different type of system, which I don't think would maximize happiness for the reasons that you said. Like, we've benefited so tremendously from living in a society in ways that I don't think we usually think about because we so take them for granted. And I'm speaking
Yeah.
specifically about our own country and our own lives. Like, for instance, I just don't see why it would be better for me if I was responsible for the plumbing within my own house that wasn't attached to a city sewer system. That
Right.
seems like
Right.
the city sewer system working
More
on
on
that
something.
level
Yeah.
is better than
Right.
for me than having to deal with it on my own, even if I have to sacrifice the freedom, I guess, of certain aspects of that not being up to me.
And you have to pay a bill.
And you have to pay a bill. Like, to me, it's just like it maximizes my happiness not to have to be responsible for that. And I
Right.
also would argue that that's sort of what it comes down to an extent, as to why some people might prefer, for instance, living in a condo over a house. Is
Right.
it's like in the house, you maximize your personal freedom of your own space, but
And
then
yet,
it's also
right.
all your own responsibility. And
Exactly.
for some people, they might love that and that might work for them. And I think that they should have the freedom to have that choice. That's why we have houses and we have condos. And I
Right.
think
Right.
that's great. But I think to suggest that the condo system is inherently less good because it's less free
Yeah.
is itself a weird thing to say, because it's like,
Right.
well, define free.
Right.
Maybe to me, free is not having to fix my own
Right.
sink if
Or
it
mow a
breaks.
lawn, yeah, or
Yeah.
rake the leaves. And yeah, there's a ton of stuff you have to do if it's your own property. I would even say, let me get my thoughts real quick here. Yeah, if society started, like, let's say you have a farming community, each person has a farm and they help each other out when they need to because they realize that they might have a problem and they'll need help too. But eventually, when you get to cities and things, you get to a situation where people are specializing. And in other words, at a farm, you go, we've got animals, we deal with our own well for water, we do everything ourselves. We have a
Mm,
big family, so we have a bunch of workers. but
yeah.
but in the end, societies in general lead to somewhat specialization. You go, this is great. This guy's learned all about how to do plumbing, which I never learned because I was busy learning how to grow
Hmm.
food. So I'm a specialist in growing the food and I can help teach people and I can help handle things. Maybe I can, whatever. So it ultimately you're actually better off with some degree at least of specialization, but you can go too far sometimes, and people can go, this is really unfortunate because then people go out camping and they go, I don't know how to do anything because I've I've lived sequestered in this other
Mm,
system. So there's what do you call it? There's pluses and minuses, and the society, if it's open enough, allows each person to find their way to a comfortable niche where they go,
yeah.
I want that house and I want to mow my lawn. The other person says, I don't want to have all those responsibilities or those pain in the ass workloads. I like
Hmm.
to do this other thing. So, you know, if you did it right, there's a niche that everybody can get to, as long as they're willing to say there's elements of sacrifice and there's elements of gratification.
Yeah.
You're
Because to
gonna,
me, I think the sad, and I guess this is sort of my concluding statement on this, but I think it's sad if you can't imagine a utilitarian collectivist system in which you don't have choices. I think it's very unimaginative and ultimately kind of sad if you just can't see how that could coexist. Because
right.
to me, it's very easy to see how those things coexist. I don't think you can have true utilitarianism that maximizes happiness without allowing choice. I just don't see how you could that could be squared, and so that's why I don't have a problem holding those beliefs at the same time. And I understand why he personally didn't. I think I do,
Right.
but I think that there was a slight lack of imagination on his part, and a bit of reactionary feeling behind the at least certainly the first part, which was why I liked the actual anecdotal sort of like little episodes
That
much
was,
better,
sure.
because I
Yeah.
think there was he was able to better show off his strengths and it hid his weaknesses, I think, a little bit better.
I wonder if anybody ever reads just the second part and whether or
Mm,
not they would get as clear a picture of this guy's issues because he goes over and over and over his issues in the first
hmm.
part. So when he appears doing things, we're very we're very clear why he does what he does
Hmm.
because of how he thinks and feels.
Yeah.
One question about utilitarianism.
Sure.
I'm a temptation is to go to the part where you go, okay, if the superficial definition for that is the greatest good for the greatest number, and then you have situations where you go, okay, can we sacrifice these people to maximize this other thing? And you go, well, that's getting tricky of who's making this decision.
Uh,
Think of like the classic examples are like we're in a rowboat with a limited amount of food, we're going to throw somebody overboard. It really works out great when you go, any volunteers? And an
mm,
old decrepit person goes, you can eat me or throw me overboard. I
yeah.
accept that as I understand that. But that means they have to be almost systematically adherents of the system to go, my turn's up because I believe in the system versus not me, not me. So it's tricky when you get to these classic
Yeah.
problems. Whereas in general, it seems like a wonderful
Well,
approach.
I guess without getting too in the weeds, because I also want us to have at least a couple minutes to talk about our next steps. But
Okay,
I to me again, like I think these are all I'm using it in a very oversimplified way, but the reason that it appeals to me is based on what I mean when I say that, which is why I talk about like first principles, because to me, utilitarianism, it depends on what it's grounded on. And to me, I think of it as what is the thing we are trying to maximize? Like specifically, what are we trying to do? And I would say happiness.
okay,
And to me, that is why when I would say, what would utilitarian tell us is the best thing to do? It's on the grounds that the decision should lead to the most happiness for the most people. And again, I can see why a person, if they were being contrarian, would come up with like some weird situations where you could make that not work or make it hard to agree with whatever the scenario is that they've come up with. But I
right.
think and I leave that to people who are more interested in dealing with that on a sort of academic basis. But functionally, that's how I have my world sort of
Right,
outlook
right. And
based
and
around.
in American politics, it would mean a left turn.
It would. It
Because
would.
yeah, because you're saying most of the people in this country are not millionaires. And in fact, it's almost like saying if you try to share the pie equally, you can't let some people take 1/4 of the pie when they
Mm-hmm.
represent 1% of the population.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
And additionally, I don't think you need to believe in God to understand why you shouldn't have 1/4 of the pie yourself.
Right, right,
Like I don't think it takes fear of God to reach that conclusion if you, which again, like I say, I don't think this works perfectly in every single situation you could conceive of, but in that one, it would work for me to say the utilitarian answer would be nobody gets a fourth because then not everybody can get pie. And if not
right,
everybody gets pie, then not everybody is happy. And so we
right,
haven't maximized happiness in this case for the most people.
right. No, I totally agree. That in those
Like I say,
situations,
it's
it's a really good system of fairness
and
to
I as I
the
say,
group.
I feel sorry that that was not a place in even in his own imagination that Dostoevsky could allow himself to go, probably partially because of his own life experiences and also perhaps and also or either or kind of the shackles of religion in a way. And again, like I say, I know that's sort of offensive to people who are very religious and take it very seriously to say that that's a weakness to be religious. I don't think it's a weakness, but I think there are limitations in what you can believe of your fellow man if you base your own morality around religion. I think you have an inherent lack of imagination then
Our
for
country is
what's
supposed
possible.
and our country is supposed to be designed to keep
Well,
that out of politics. It's supposed to be
yeah.
state, which is getting very muddied. And
Uh,
recent, really good, very good show on the radio today about a guy who's written a book, I think, about, and I can't think of what his name was, Christian nationalism. I think that's what he
mm,
called it. And he said that's a thing that he sees on the rise and very in your face of people who oh yeah, the guy does a podcast. The idea is our country was intended to be Christian. That's the
Yeah.
belief. And you'd go, Christianity does seem to be the dominant thing. Did you notice that we have people from all different faiths and atheists and agnostics and everything you can imagine living here? They're going, yes, but when the example they gave, they said, if we're all going to sit down at the table, the Christian person has to have predominance.
Mm,
That's fucked up because that's exactly what we're trying to avoid is the special interest thing.
yeah.
That's why religion was supposed to get excluded from the political system. It's like, you want to go to that church? Fine. It says be kind to your fellow man. Go ahead. That's good. If it says torture people, it's going to lead to government intervention saying you guys aren't okay here because that's intruding on other people's lives who have the political should have the political freedom to live their lives the way they want to.
Mm.
If religion is just your private bugaboo, that's fine. But if it starts intruding, it's not okay.
Which, as I
Very,
say, I mean,
well, it should be.
yeah, and I reiterate, therein lies to me the irony of tying a belief in God to
Your life.
your no to like your morality and your
Oh,
moral
yeah,
system and especially a belief that freedom and free will is like the most important thing. That to me is I will reiterate the irony of
yeah,
tying the idea that free will is the most important thing to you must believe in God. Because I
yeah.
just don't see how that I see how he arrived at that conclusion, but I think in reality it doesn't usually play out that way. And I think that's what leads me to feel like this was a very reactionary text from him, which is actually one of the things I want to read in March. Is he did this collection of essays called Winter Notes on Summer Impressions
Okay.
that is the brainchild that led to Notes from Underground,
Okay.
apparently. And it was based on 10 weeks that he spent in Europe. And I think he mostly is talking about Paris and London.
Okay.
And he was not impressed,
And he
evidently.
was, yeah, he's very concerned about Western influence on the Slavic world of Russia.
Correct. And that this was the other sort of anxieties of his that was bound up along with this issue of or not existentialism, of determinism
Yeah,
and
that
and
guy's books. Tremendous.
progress and of like engineering and all of that. Like
Right.
those two things together were, from my understanding, from what Matlaw was talking about, if he's to be trusted, about where Notes from Underground came from. So I'm going to actually read that with my Dostoevsky book club in March
Okay.
because it's going backwards in time slightly to do so, but I personally am interested enough to do that.
You want me to join you in that? I mean, not
If
your
you
book
would like,
club,
I
but
would be delighted to. Yeah, I think it would be
well,
really
what's it called?
interesting.
Winter notes, winter thoughts.
Winter notes on summer impressions. I have some random David Patterson translation from Northwestern University, but it
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, I'll
Um,
look for a copy of that.
yeah, I think that would be a really fun one to just again, I'm sort of sorry I didn't read this first because temporally this came first, but
Right.
we are where we are, lives are what they are. But other than that, are there any other reading projects you have on the go or anything you're looking
Um,
towards in March?
well, nothing that I would push as like a podcast. I mean, I'm
Oh, I just meant like you personally, like what are
oh
your
yeah, yeah.
reading?
I'm thinking,
What's going on?
after I'm
Yeah.
finishing Vanity Fair, I've got like 40 pages to go. It's taken me forever. Then I'm planning to read finally The Fraud that you got me
Mm.
a copy of. I'm interested in that. And then I also want to go into after I want to read that, and then I want to read Mason and Dixon by Pynchon.
Ooh.
I want to get back to Pynchon. I'm also interested in side projects, so I'll read this too. Some of the if the book's not too huge, like I read another book that I really liked a lot, Claire Kerrigan, I think her name is.
Are you talking about Claire Keegan?
Keegan, yeah, Claire Keegan. Small things like these. Very
Yeah.
good, very good. I kind of got turned on to her because I saw a comment by George Saunders, whom I think
Mm.
is a very good writer, and he said Claire Keegan is among the best writers in the world or something like that.
She gained a lot of traction on BookTube and Book Talk as well because, well, I think probably just on her own merits, but also because one of the biggest voices, I guess, one of the biggest content creators for Book Talk and BookTube really likes her and had read a couple of her books in a row and talked about how
Yeah,
much he liked
yeah,
them. So she's
yeah.
definitely in the mix of just like popular reading right now as well. I haven't read anything by her yet, but I would like to because I haven't nailed down a an Irish author that I want for my Reading Around the World challenge, but she's a
Okay.
top contender because she's being talked about a lot right now, and I know people really, really like her.
Yeah, she apparently she's mostly a short story writer. Nothing that
Hmm.
she's written is super long. Very That's very true of Saunders too. He has one novel that reads almost more like a play, and
Mm.
the rest of his work is short stories. So that may be what attracted him to her. But she is very good, and it's also been made into a film apparently with what's the guy's name? Cillian Murphy,
Oh yeah.
playing the main character who's a man,
Mm-mm.
and she does a great job. It's just really it's it's one of those things that, like, I read a lot of things that have symbolic relevance and things, structural things going on, and very clever sentences. Hers is refreshingly very straightforward, but so meticulously detailed with just the right touch of a simple act. The person does picks up their coffee cup a certain way or whatever.
Yeah.
Every little touch is just really, really excellent, so that you just feel completely enveloped in this world. And it's a really good story.
Yeah, I've
All
heard
things
really, really
considered.
good things about her. Yeah, absolutely. I should prioritize getting around to her, but for me, I think March is going to be a kind of a nonfiction month. I don't know. That just happened to be the way that the world worked for me
Yeah,
this
yeah,
year.
yeah. No, nonfiction's
Um,
wonderful.
yeah, I don't tend to, well, I shouldn't say that because that's changed significantly, but traditionally I wasn't reading a lot of nonfiction, but I've come to diversify my reading primarily in that way. I think just because I don't know, I've discovered that it can be quite good, actually. But a piece of fiction that I just finished actually for a book club that I'm in that I adored and I thought it was just, I mean, if Dostoevsky was wallowing in the hero of the mud, this book was the kind of antidote to that, where it was incredibly humanist, which
Oh,
was On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous,
oh,
which is a fabulous title, by Ocean. I know I always say this incorrectly. I asked one of my students about this. It's Vung, I think. But anyway, but that book is just so, I think, it was what I needed to read to counterbalance the Dostoevsky one, which, by the way, I don't think I ever actually came out and said. I actually really liked it. I know we were critiquing a lot,
yeah.
Notes from Underground, but I think for me, my criticism mostly is of his little diatribe at the beginning, but I think that the three episodes that he actually writes, I really enjoyed. But nevertheless, it is very negative and nihilistic and unpleasant, even if I could see myself perhaps in the Underground Mound in that first episode. But yeah, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous is a gorgeous novel. I mean, it covers a lot of really nasty elements of humanity. I mean, it takes place during the opioid crisis. It's about intergenerational trauma within this Vietnamese family that moved to the United States as a direct result of the Vietnam War. Um,
Okay.
some of it takes place during the Vietnam War, which was obviously very ugly, and there's a lot of ugly things that he's acknowledging are true and real and an unfortunate part of the human experience as we've designed it. But it lands on a very humanist, optimistic note that beauty and love are still going to overpower those other things and that they're worth pushing
Okay.
through the nastiness to get to. And it's really wonderful. He's normally a poet, I believe, and I can
Okay.
see his poetic sensibilities in the way that he writes. Anyway, so I just read that one. But looking forward, March is going to be full of basically three things.
Okay.
Winter notes on summer impressions is for
Right.
sure a concrete thing I'm going to be reading. by Dostoevsky. It'll be my first nonfiction thing by him. I've never read anything of his that was not fiction.
Yeah,
So
I
I'm
don't think
really
I have
interested
either.
for him to not have this pretense of the not Dostoevsky character and to just kind of speak for himself a little bit.
Right.
Um, and then I also have a couple of biographies and autobiographies. I don't think I'll get through all of them, but I'm going to sift through about famous chess players
Oh, wow.
and either writing about or not even just famous chess players, but like chess players of some level or other, talking about their own experience playing chess or chess within their lives.
Huh.
And maybe a biography about a famous chess player, but I haven't decided which one yet.
Hmm.
But that's something that's gonna happen this month in some way or other.
You
And
involved in chess now at all or no?
well, sort of. It's just like when I it's when I've kind of got like a vague idea stewing in my mind about a story I want to write, and I think chess will be involved.
Interesting.
Um, so I'm double checking that theory by reading about it and seeing if I'm still as interested on the other side of that.
Do you know, I don't know if you may not want to have any other chess stuff thrown at you if you've got a plan, but did you ever see the movie Chess Story?
No, the by Stefan Zweig, the
Right,
film
right.
version of the. I
Exactly.
haven't that. So the funny thing about this is, as a very brief aside, because we don't need to wallow in this too much, but the reason I haven't watched the movie is because I want to read the book. The reason I
Okay.
haven't read the book is because no
You want to read
libraries that I have
it.
access to has it. The bookstore that I have access to easily doesn't have it. And I could easily get a copy online, but I refuse to pay as much as they want me to. I want to find
Yeah,
a cheap copy of it, and I have been
yeah.
unable to find one that's under $15, which sounds
Wow.
kind of miserly of me. However, considering that shipping into Canada is so expensive, the cheaper I can get the book, the better I can justify like $20 for shipping for a book. So that's the
Wow.
reason I
Yeah.
haven't read it
That's wild. I know at our library, strangely enough, just by
yet.
coincidence, the movie has nothing to do with this next thing.
Yeah. Mm,
Somebody apparently donated, or no, somebody promoted Stefan Zweig to some
mm,
librarian who then ordered a whole ton of his stuff. And then somebody else said to me one day, this is not moving at all. It would really be good if you would read something of this guy. So
mm,
I would like to help it go out and
mhm,
back in. So I picked up something and I read several of his stories, and two of them I didn't really like that much, but one of them I did a lot. And then
mm,
when I saw that movie too, I was very impressed with the storyline and the acting in that particular movie. But
mm,
anyway, Stephen Zweig's very interesting. Oh, there's also a movie that I did see that's a biography that's based on his life,
mm.
or the end point of his life, more or less, when he left Europe and went to South America, Brazil, or somewhere, and eventually committed suicide
Oh, I
because
didn't know
because of the German catastrophe. So
that.
anyway, very interesting person. He was a really,
Mm,
really big name during his lifetime, and he's kind of fallen a little bit down the list
mm.
for
Well,
most people. Anyway,
that
yeah,
particular story though, I am very interested in. So if you happen to see a good secondhand copy and you want to get me a gift, that
yeah,
is
yeah,
on my
yeah.
short list of books that I probably will not buy for myself
No,
anytime
no. If
soon.
I'm able to do that before you and your mom make your trip, in
Mhm.
a couple of weeks from now, whatever it is, I'll try. She's going to bring a bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
You'll have to,
mostly books.
and you might have to sift through it to see how much weight you can handle. But if I can get that, I will. So if
Yeah,
you find a book that has that story in it,
yeah,
or
exactly. I
novella
mean, like I
maybe.
said, I that's the one I'm interested in. If it happens, if it's just a standalone, that's fine. If it happens to be within a collection, I'll probably just end up reading the whole thing. But yeah, so chess I've got on the radar for sure. And then if I'm still feeling up to it, I might also read Critique of Commodity Aesthetics, or at least I'll start it.
Wow,
Which I mentioned in our last, I think I mentioned that in our last
that
episode that
sounds
I'm kind
vaguely
of interested.
familiar as a title.
Yeah, it's from one of the lesser known or like less talked about members of the Frankfurt School.
Okay,
But it's basically about I mean, I haven't read it, but it's kind of taking Marxism and looking at marketing through that lens and like
okay,
how marketing shapes culture.
Okay.
is my understanding and
Yeah,
interest.
I'd like to hear your take on that if you get a
I'm
chance to
yeah,
read it.
so I might dip my toes into that if I get to it. So those are sort of the things that I have on the horizon, I think. So it's going to be a lot of heavy nonfiction. Well, I don't know if the chess biographies will be that heavy, but like
Yeah. Well,
that's
still,
what I
nonfiction is a completely different kettle of fish.
oh, definitely. So I'm kind of looking forward to it. I'll probably also have like some trashy 80s horror novels in there just for seasoning, lest I become the underground man in my serious
You become the
contemplation of
grumpy underground man.
yeah, I don't
I'm,
need to be him. I think
yeah,
that's kind of where we were gonna leave things. So thank you for talking about that. It sounds like we'll be Dostoevskying it up again in March,
okay.
potentially, for
Yeah,
probably the April episode would be my feeling,
that
potentially.
sounds good because you're going to be busy during that month with other kinds of reading and travel and all that. So
Oh gosh. Well, it sounds like you're busy with Vanity Fair.
I'm hoping
Um,
to finish that this week, and then I'm going to move
well, I
on to
hope you're liking
tomorrow.
it for how long it's
Yeah, yeah.
taken you to
No,
get
it's very
through it.
interesting. I'm taking copious notes, a lot of interesting things in the footnotes that give me pause to think
Mm,
about of historical issues of the time. And
yeah.
anyway, it's been interesting. I'm happy I read it.
That's always a good way to end a long tome like that. That's kind of how I felt about Dostoevsky overarchingly. Is it's like, wow, that first part sure was a lot, but I'm glad
Wow.
that I read it.
Yeah, I'm very glad that he did the second part.
I am too. I think I would have felt much differently had he not. Maybe that's how we'll feel with notes, winter notes on summer impressions. Like maybe we would have been better off without it, but I don't know. We'll see.
Well,
So,
we'll only know by reading it. So
exactly.
good
And
for
as
us.
for everybody else, happy reading to you guys as well. In addition to Dostoevsky, I hope you read other things that bring you joy.
Happiness is good.
Happiness is good. In summation, from Notes from Underground, happiness is good. Don't be the underground man,
So that does not
please.
appear in the book, but he secretly means that.
He secretly means that. All right, Dee. Well, I will talk to you, I guess, on Sunday, probably.
I think that is a Zoom. And hopefully you're there, and I'll try to be there. I love you.
Love you too.
Bye bye.
Bye.